There are many facets to Ali Pashazadeh, the surgeon, MBA, venture capitalist, and strategic advisor who heads Treehill Partners. A career spent treating patients, directing money into treatments for patients, and observing the results has crystallized strong opinions on biotechnology strategy, so strong, in fact, that Ali might refute my calling them opinions. At Treehill, Ali and his team solve problems, sometimes after the problem, like a bad readout, for example, has unexpectedly raised its head. But mostly they solve problems before the symptoms of those problems even appear, when only a sage soothsayer who's seen it coming before is qualified to course correct. I'm Matt Pillar. This is The Business of Biotech, and on today's show, we're talking obviation, preventing badness by removing its source, with Treehill Partners' Ali Pashazadeh. Ali, it's great to see you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you. I had the benefit so our listeners know, I had the benefit of a conversation with Ali, I don't know, a week, 10 days ago. And since then, I've been pretty enthusiastic about getting this podcast recording done because he's got I'm not going to set the precedent or set the bar too high here for you, Ali, but he's got a pretty no holds barred approach to his take on what's right and what's wrong in biotech right now. But I want to start. You know, I mentioned in my little rambling prologue there that you're a surgeon. So that's where I want to start. Like these background stories are always so fascinating to me. What does a surgeon, what motivates, I should say, a surgeon who's, trained in surgery to earn the MBA, get into investment banking, initially, I think, with Goldman Sachs? What was the story back then? What was going on in your head?
The story back then, I think it's a relatively linear thread in the sense of that there is a logic to what might seem like a random series of changes. I moved into life sciences in the late 80s, early 90s, because one of our family friends died of breast cancer, and I had this naive vision of curing breast cancer and going down that route. I loved biology. I loved how the human body thought, how it had multiple systems, redundancies, and pathways, which then led me down the route of either going to marine biology or going into human biology. And I was talked out of marine biology into human biology, and I loved my medical school years of understanding how the body functioned. So the first step is understanding normality, how the body functions, and how the body has multiple systems and fail-safe loops and ways of course correcting. And then you move on to pathology, and then the minute you start moving into pathology, you end up as essentially, I think, in two camps. Camp one is as a surgeon, do you like treating chronic conditions, or do you like actually trying to operate on a patient, for example, or remove a tumor?
Yeah.
And then within that, you end up in a pathway where either you create the hole or you essentially fill the hole. So do you enjoy taking the tumor out, or do you actually try to restore normality? And within that, I spent a lot of time as a plastic and reconstructive surgery, always enjoyed the acute care setting. So trained as a surgeon. Now, on a personal note, you might say, well, how did you get into that in the first place? And a lot of it is down to people saying, oh, you're not bright enough to get into medicine. Then you get into medicine, they go, oh, you're not bright enough to get into surgery. Then they go, you're really not really a plastic surgery person. You really shouldn't do it. So when you look at a two-dimensional human being, it looks like someone who is striving to achieve. But a lot of us are driven by usually negative experiences where people say, you think you could be one of the top X, Y, and Z, and you think, yeah, I actually can do that. And then within surgery, I've never wanted to leave medicine. I was never looking to move out of medicine, but I was always intrigued by how relatively pedestrian the rate of evolution of how we treat patients are. So moving into medicine in 1989, and now we're sitting at 2024, the treatment of the appendicitis is exactly the same treatment of appendicitis as it was at the beginning. That the diagnosis of meningitis is exactly the same as it was 30 years ago, for example. So within that, yes, there's been huge advances in diagnostics, technology, etc. But there have been significant areas where things haven't improved. So as I was intrigued by understanding the kind of how drugs were developed, I realized that actually the approach there probably was to marry a medical and scientific background with an investment banking background to understand how companies function, how drugs are developed. And I was lucky enough to get a place at London Business School that taught me how to learn a new language of business. So you go from seeing patients and pathologies to spreadsheets and PowerPoints. And the day before I went to London Business School, I remember doing my monthly expenses, and I opened up a spreadsheet and I wrote down the numbers into each cell, and then on a calculator I then added those numbers up. So the day before I started London Business School, I didn't know how to use Excel. So all of a sudden you're now in a different language. Yeah. And then within that, you realize at Goldman that there are multiple incredibly good companies, incredibly good drug developers that are doing exactly the same as doctors, which is trying to find new therapies and advancing therapies for patients. And within that, I was at Goldman, lucky enough to get into the Goldman healthcare team and stay there for a number of years and work with incredibly good people, learn from them as to how drug development companies function, how they build a pipeline, and how those pipelines move initially from smaller companies, a lot of times to larger companies, and what really drives the market. Mm-hmm. And that career then moved on to UBS. And then I was fortunate enough to join Blackstone and start seeing more of the investing side of things. And in 2014, one of the team at Blackstone and I formed Treehill Partners and tried to take investment banking and advisory a couple of steps forward in terms of what we thought kind of clients needed in order to fuse a medical and scientific lens on corporate transactions.
Yeah. When you decided to pursue the investment banking track, did you face some of the same objections? Was anyone telling you you're not bright enough to be an investment banker?
Oh, absolutely. But on a personal note, when you're incapable of using Excel, yeah, because you did an on-call the night before and you resuscitated a 5-year-old who had inhaled something, and the next day you go in and you're judged by your Excel capabilities. You all of a sudden go from being the smartest to the dumbest quite quickly. Yeah. So you're now living on your wits and your horsepower, but actually you've never used Excel, you haven't used PowerPoint, you don't know what a font is, and why would you? Because that's not what we needed to survive in medicine. And then within, it's 2001 is when the milk round at London Business School, the banks started coming around, and I realized that I had zero chance of anybody hiring me, and there was zero reason why they should hire me. So what I then did at the age of kind of mid to late 20s was to break down my capabilities into components that were transferable. So a person who can stand in an acute care setting can make a decision, can work off in complete information. Where in banking does that sit? Someone who has integrity and ask an honest question will give you an honest answer. Where in banking would that fit? Would that fit within consulting? Would that fit in investment banking? And where would the culture be? So what I did is I spent probably 6 months working with people from Goldman, with Merrill Lynch, etc., trying to understand what they could possibly find in me that was interesting. And out of the 700 people at London Business School, I think I probably was the last person anybody would have expected to get an internship at Goldman. And then when I got the internship, I know there was a lot of doubters that I could then convert that into a full-time offer. Part of that is a desire and a being fortunate. So anybody who gets somewhere, can't always say that they got there based on merit. And part of it was I needed the money to finish my business school degree. I wasn't earning enough as a doctor to be able to fund London, all of London Business School. So I needed the internship and I needed the sign-on bonus to be able to do the second year of business school. So if you look at any story again on the CV and then you look behind the story, usually it comes from people who couldn't afford to fail and had to succeed. Now, were there doubters? There were absolutely doubters. And I always think that you take the negativity of any doubters of can a doctor transfer to banking, and you take all that negativity and you kind of put it into a tight ball and you use that as your source of driver to prove people wrong, and then hopefully over time you mentor other doctors and other healthcare professionals to get into kind of learn from the mistakes. But one thing that is absolutely paramount in this, you will not succeed on your own. There is no way in the world Ali could have made that journey without having friends and colleagues and who are now personal friends 20 years later hold my hand and walk me down those corridors. And part of the culture that Goldman had, in my experience, was those people also had their hands held and walked down the corridors. And 20 years on, I do that for the next generation. So part of it is one's own drive and one's own ability and horsepower and intelligence and drive, etc. But a significant part of it is that people within that organization reaching over the table and saying, look, I'll help you get in.
Yeah. I've asked this question 100 times on this podcast in various forms, but everyone answers it with a different perspective. I've interviewed hundreds of physician scientists turned, we'll say physician scientists and or academic researchers, turned biotech executives. And there are, you talk about horsepower and drive. I think there's a thread of commonality in terms of that sort of inherent, innate, like personality that leads them and enables them to get to the business side, right? To get to biotech or biopharmaceutical leadership as opposed to scientific, purely scientific leadership. But everyone answers that question a different way. So aside from sort of that support structure that you mentioned, the people around you to follow the lead, like what do you think is inherent within Ali Pashazadeh that, I guess, enables from within that transition from I am a surgeon to the business side, which is a completely different language.
So I think some of the components, if I was looking at a junior and trying to mentor someone to kind of make a decision, first of all are you running from something or are you running to something? So are you running towards money, power, prestige, or are you someone who has a difficult background and that difficult background drives you to succeed? So the first one is you need to understand yourself and what drives you. The second thing is, I think that there is a humility that one needs to have as a clinician, which is when a patient comes in, you have a hypothesis of what that patient has, and a humility to know that you may be wrong, and actually you need to take a step back and learn and understand that the data that you receive from that patient, or the X-ray, or the CT, or the MRI, may completely change the hypothesis you had. So I think as you're transitioning from medicine to banking or anything else, is a humility to know that you may be the best microsurgeon in the country one minute, the next day you need a calculator to kind of add up Excel because you didn't know there was an add function. So the first thing is the humility point. Second thing is, I think there needs to be, to some extent, a purity in what you're trying to achieve. I don't see myself as a doctor turned investment banker or venture capital executive. I stepped in 1989 into medical school to learn about human biology and to help patients. One tool that I used was my medical knowledge and expertise, and I still do that, with patients. The other tool is an investment banking tool. My driver is to help companies get products onto the market, make as few mistakes as they can, and the products that should get on the market, use our experience to help them get on the market. The driver isn't fees, titles, or any sort of, limelight. The objective here, needs to be, if you're doing it, in my mind, is you genuinely have a desire to help patients, and that desire hasn't gone away. And when I step into my medical gown, it's a desire to help patients individually. When this morning we had a 2-hour a conversation with a company that is veering off in the wrong direction in a breast cancer treatment, and we're saying, look, we've worked in breast cancer for 35 years. This is how we think you can get your interesting therapy to patients. This is how you can go from A to Z, and this is how you can navigate it. You're not helping patient by patient, but you are helping a group of patients.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a commonality between the two worlds.
Yeah. And I want to inform our listeners that when you say, when I step into a gown, when I gown up, you mean that in real time, because you still practice a bit of medicine.
I still practice medicine. Yeah, I still see patients, and I still have my medical license, and I would do everything I could to maintain that until the day I retire.
Why do you continue to do that?
It's a bit like being a pilot. If you've gone through all of the training to be a pilot, and then you start lecturing people on how to fly or teaching, etc., the question people ask you is, when was the last flight you did? Can you fly? Because when you're a pilot, you're in a privileged seat. You have limited standard deviation for errors, and your errors have material consequences. The minute you stop being a pilot and you start becoming a lecturer about how to fly, you have a lifespan of 3 to 5 years before, the next generation say, excuse me, sir, when was the last time you flew? How do you know what it's like to fly? So when I sit talking to people and they're talking to me about breast cancer treatment, I can look back a month and say, last fungating breast cancer I saw in an 84-year-old was a month ago. So the same fungating breast cancer that I saw in 1996, I still see in 2024. So we can talk about immunotherapy, we can talk about targeted, therapies, and we can talk about highfalutin stuff. But this 84-year-old did not present until she had a fungating tumor. So is hormonal breast cancer still relevant to us? Is early diagnosis and patient access still relevant to us? This is relevant in 2024 as it was in 1995 or 96. So in that context, I think unless you remain relevant and current as a doctor, you start becoming a banker who, puts on a rose-tinted glasses and says, well, when I was a doctor, I used to do this. I think for me, I wouldn't be able to respect myself unless I saw patients and I was real-time living the hypothesis of what it's like to treat patients. And I think being current and relevant, and it is difficult because I go through the same revalidation process every year as any other clinician, and I'm held to the same standards as any other clinician. But what that does do is it again, it goes back to the humility, because you step into a emergency room context or a surgical theater, and you're surrounded by people who are incredibly intelligent, incredibly bright, incredibly dedicated, and any sort of arrogance one might have very quickly boils down to decision by decision making for patients. So I think keeping yourself current is incredibly relevant to being a good banker or being a good consultant.
Yeah. Where did the exposure to biotech and biopharma therapeutic endeavors come from? That was a result of your work at Goldman and UBS and Blackstone?
Yeah. So exactly. So when I went to the Goldman healthcare team, the mentorship I received is, look, you're coming in your mid to late 20s, you're surrounded by incredibly smart people, and they've all got 5 to 10 years worth of experience. If you're twice as smart as they are, it'll take you 10 years to catch up with these people. So how do they continue being smart and continue to learn and advance themselves? What have you got which no one else has? And the answer was, okay, I've got a medical background, a scientific background, and I can talk to healthcare companies and understand what they do from a molecular perspective, a mechanistic perspective, and nobody else in the team does. So then when I spoke to the head of the healthcare team, He said, look, you don't know how to be a banker. I don't know how to be a doctor. Why don't you come into my team and I'll teach you what we do, and you provide your input, and we as a team will be a stronger team at Goldman than compared to Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Bank of America. And as I gained more and more exposure to high quality companies like AstraZeneca and GSK and the high quality companies, I realized that a significant proportion of my colleagues were very, very smart, very, very capable, far more capable than I was. But they didn't understand the subject matter. They didn't know the difference between they couldn't quantify how relevant a treatment was going to be. They couldn't quantify the materiality of certain decisions being made. And I thought to myself at that point, I can be quite impactful to my team within Goldman by being able to turn around and say, look, out of the 50 things that we've heard, these are the 1 or 2 bullet points that will make this transaction more likely to happen or less likely to happen. Mm-hmm. And over time, as the CEOs of those biotechs started becoming friends and colleagues, etc., I realized that actually there are a number of universes. One is you're sitting within a large organization like a GSK or AstraZeneca. And then you've got a slew of smaller companies running on a shoestring, believing that they have technology or products that can change the market. And those companies are in greater need of support and help and input and guidance than obviously the GSK. So I started gravitating towards how can I work not only with the larger players, but also how could my background possibly be of help to these smaller companies that have great potential.